Hi there everyone, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawwalker, your host, and today we're going to be checking out this new album from stoner rock, prog rock, and or doom metal outfit Elder with this new album, Innate Passage. Elder is a good band. They are a good band. I do think that a lot of their work over the past few years, post Reflections of a Floating World, have really started venturing into prog rock pretty heavily, and to me, I think that that has yielded pretty inconsistent results. Mind you, inconsistent doesn't always spell disaster, but I can't help but feel like Omens was a step in the wrong direction for this band, which I feel has largely until this point been inching away from their doom metal sound. And I'm not saying that the world necessarily needs more Sabbath-like doom metal, because there is very much an abundance, if not an overabundance, of bands that work in that sound and style. But Elder on Lore, and especially Reflections of a Floating World, found a really delicate balance between this heavy sound and this more prog-oriented sound, and those scales have been tipping, and even on this new record have yet to tip back in a lot of cases. However, even with this album, Innate Passage being a slight step back into some of those more heavier, more grounded sounds, there are plenty of moments where the writing on this thing sounds like I'm listening to a cross between a Steven Wilson track and a High on Fire song, which sounds like it would be cool on paper, but here it's kind of like they've taken the more frustrating elements from both, with tons of riffs that lack substance or weight, and progressive production that doesn't really lend itself well to many of the tracks, simply because it's just too clean in a lot of areas. Also, the fairly excessive piano and synths this album uses are very hit and miss. I can appreciate some of the touches here to pad out some of the recording and really create a cool, multi-layered soundscape, but a lot of this still sounds like it's pulling ideas very blatantly from, like, In the Court of the Crimson King specifically. I do also think that the vocals suffer on this release quite a bit, actually. There's a lack of variety on this album as far as all of the vocal work is concerned, and that would be fine if the vocals were more than average at best. The vocals are pretty much what you would get if you took Dan Avidan's work from when he was doing stuff with Skyhill and made it slightly more strained and not really in a good way. And I know I've laid into this thing pretty heavily right off the bat, and it's not that this album is bad, because it's really not. It's actually fairly decent, but I can't help but feel like this is Elder just about to hit their once more round the sun moment. I'm sure a fair amount of you guys have listened to at least some Mastodon, so I'll explain it like this. With the exception of a few large singles like Blood and Thunder, Mastodon went from being a really unique heavy band that slowly stepped further and further into prog rock, and that run is pretty apparent from Remission all the way to Once More Round the Sun, which was a massive breakout album with some of their best and yet still frustratingly easy to overplay material yet. And yes, this is a fairly broad comparison to be making, but with the way that a lot of people are looking at this record right now, I've been getting a lot of really similar feelings about this record as I did to Once More Round the Sun. And yes, these are very different records we're talking about, and by no means has this achieved the same amount of commercial success. I'm not saying Elder is selling out, nor do I think Mastodon have necessarily sold out despite the Game of Thrones cameos. What I'm getting at is that I think Elder has reached a point creatively that is good, and I think it deserves a fair amount of praise and kudos for being a really palatable album, but I can't help but feel like it's going to take another couple of albums to get out of this rift that they've landed in. Prog metal is a vast and frustrating landscape, and it seems that so many of these doom-oriented bands have a tendency to overextend into them, trying to add new elements and add new stuff into their sound. And at the end of the day, there's really only so far you can get before you reach that spectrum of technically impressive but practically very tedious. And that's not to say that there aren't moments here where tedious swaps out with a really well-structured building of tension, like the last track, The Purpose, which I think might be one of the best cuts here. But there's plenty of moments that really land in the category of tedious, like this album's only single, Endless Return, which is a cool song and kind of an apt title until it really feels like the endless part of the song title really seems to be pulling a lot of weight. The album opener, Catastasis, does a pretty good job of easing the listener's way into the record, and while I normally wouldn't be the biggest fan of the synths on this thing, I don't think that they feel particularly out of place like I would have expected. Also, with this being the first track, I definitely think that they went out of their way to pick the most well-thought-out vocal melodies, because this is more or less the peak of those as well. Coalescence reminds me a ton of late-era Opeth tracks, and like those, I hear this and I've got my fingers crossed for a heavy segment that never comes. And it's not that this song is particularly bad, it just doesn't really inspire much thought past the fact that these riffs make this song feel like a nearly 10-minute long collection of jams that could have been outtakes from, like, I don't know, a chemist practice session. This album's epic, Merged in Dreams, I do think is good. I think it does justify its runtime well enough, generally being on the well-calculated building of tension side of things as opposed to the tedious march forward. Honestly, I think I would have just really appreciated this track and The Purpose released together as an EP a lot more than this collection of tracks as a full album. I think that this approach of exceptionally long songs is a gimmick that people think is good or cool, especially in prog, because, you know, the logic being, hey, you know, all of my favorite prog tracks are the long, epic songs. Let's just do a full album of that, which miraculously has worked pretty well for Elder considering how long a lot of their songs actually are. But when you move further into this prog style and away from these walls of sonic destruction like you'd find in a standard Doom track, the songs tend to suffer because, frankly, the writing is just not as interesting as you might think it would be. And at least with Doom or death metal, the sheer weight of impact that a lot of those riffs work with is enough to do really all of the heavy lifting, and as an example, just listen to like any Yob record. I really do like Elder, and I think I may be more critical of this release as a result of that general appreciation, but I'm really hoping that there is some more variety introduced and presented on their next release, because this is a really mixed bag, even between moments in the same tracks. All things considered though, this album is still worth checking out even with its problems. Most of what I've had to criticize here is very much a matter of specific taste, and it isn't necessarily going to bother everyone, and I do intend on keeping at least a couple of tracks from this in my rotation. But for me, Innate Passage as an overall album is probably a 6, maybe a 7. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of this one in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe, and if you like what I'm doing here, drop a tip in the PayPal. Check out my Instagram, my Reverb, and my Depop. Links to all of those are in the description below. Thank you all so much again, and we'll see you on the flip side.